what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you have nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Hi friends, welcome back to Seeds of Revolution. Today I am so proud and so happy to have with us a good friend of mine, my buddy from Arizona, my brother from another mother, the Michael Corleone to my Tom Hagen, Joe Watson, my buddy Joe. How you doing, bud?
I'm good, buddy. Thank you very much for asking me to be on this. I feel quite honored to be on Seeds of Revolution.
It is us who are honored by your presence. Joe, in addition to being my friend for many, many years and my co-conspirator for just as long, he is the owner and operator of his own media consulting firm, Hey Joe Media. He has done all sorts of different things in the prison reform, ending mass incarceration, confronting the realities of American mass incarceration system. He has a lot of personal experience with that system. And I wanted to have him on to today's show to talk about what it's like to actually live through America's mass incarceration system, what comes out the other side of that experience, and how people like Joe can use their experience, their intellect, and their, dare I say, optimism to try and make the world a better place. So, hey, bud, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. We've known each other now for almost 10 years.
Almost 10
Which is
years. And
crazy, yeah.
every day we get grayer and it gets better.
Yeah. Yeah. Better, that's debatable, but definitely grayer. Definitely grayer.
Well, I say better. So, Joe, if you could start off by just introducing ourselves to our listeners,
Sure.
telling us, what your experience is with the American criminal justice system, how you got involved in the first place. I especially think our Canadian audience will be very interested to hear the difference between what they see on TV and movies and what it's actually like when somebody like you lives through it.
Sure. So I used to be a journalist. I started out as a sports writer and eventually became an investigative magazine writer for what we call a alternative news weekly in the US.
And this was in Phoenix, correct?
Yeah, this was in Phoenix. I'd worked at a couple national magazines, worked on the East Coast, and then came back to Arizona, which I've called home for far too long. And I was offered a job as a staff writer at Phoenix New Times, which at the time was part of the Village Voice sort of chain of newspapers. And I, I had some serious imposter syndrome when I was working there. I was missing deadlines. I looked around me and I saw these incredible writers and journalists who had gone to Yale and Columbia Journalism School and were just winning awards left and right. And, honestly, I was a dropout from Arizona State University. But I loved to write and I had a knack for coming up with good story ideas. But I felt like that wasn't gonna, you know, keep me employed for long. I needed to improve as a writer and I just wasn't getting it, I felt. Nobody necessarily complained. It was mostly in my head, as imposter syndrome goes. And so I turned to, whatever could help me escape these feelings of dread and self-loathing and all of that. And so one of those things was gambling. I became a compulsive gambler. It went on for a couple of years. I lost so many friendships and so many relationships out of it. And toward the end there, I just kind of lost all hope. And, I was literally about to drive over the edge of a cliff when my sort of, I guess, inner survivor mode turned on and I decided, you know what, I want to keep going. I want to keep gambling. That's really all I had was to gamble. And so I ended up robbing several small businesses in the Phoenix area. I went on a string of these armed robberies. And after a month, I was arrested and jailed. And, I had to come to terms with a lot of things about myself that I needed to deal with. Jail and prison are not the places to deal with those things, but we'll get into that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it became such a bad problem that not only did I lose so many people in my life that I loved and respected and the career that I had, I ended up committing this string of felonies, which was my first time ever in the criminal justice system. Um,
At what point did you realize, I assume it was after you were arrested, but at what point did you realize that you were going to be fed into this system that you'd never experienced before? And that I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that having read about it and seen about it in media, you were obviously terrified of.
yeah, I mean, I was terrified, and at the same time, I was under the delusion that the criminal justice system wasn't for me. I was,
Who did you think it was for?
I mean, it was for people who really meant to do bad, like bad people, right? That's who the criminal justice system was for, was the worst of the worst, right? Because that's what we're told. We're told that there are really bad people in this world, that there's no way that they have ever been or will ever be good, and we're going to lock those people up. So I figured, hey,
Sort of the corollary of good people don't do bad things.
for
Therefore,
sure.
all of the bad things must be done by inherently bad people.
That's right. Exactly. And so, I knew I wasn't an inherently bad person. And all I needed was an opportunity to explain myself. You know, I'm not a bad person. I just went crazy for a little while. You guys can understand that. You guys sanction gambling. You have created this system where people can go and wager and become addicted to the process and the sport of gaming. And, you created this animal. All I have to do is tell you that I, you know, became addicted to it. You'll understand because, of course, you understand that people are going to get addicted to this. And then you'll say, okay, we'll let you go. We just need you to get some treatment. I was under this delusion, Joel, obviously. And
What point was that delusion shattered, Joe?
it took me a few months, to be honest with you. It still took me a few months after I was arrested. And then even still, it wasn't fully, I didn't, I didn't really stop sort of being a victim until I was actually sentenced to prison. But, I went to jail. They gave me a pretty high bond. In other words, I'm not sure how the Canadian system works, but in other words,
Not like that, my friend. Not like that, fortunately.
yeah, but, they told me I would have to pay $400,000, half of which had to be in cash to be able to get out of jail to fight my case. I didn't have that. I had gambled away my last $5 before I got arrested. And, so I was in jail with, a lot of folks who didn't come from my background, but I found who I could relate to. These were people who had experienced either poverty or, like in my case, I was raised in a debt poor family. Folks who were always struggling, living paycheck to paycheck, instability. I came from, parents who divorced when I was very young and were married multiple times, were in abusive relationships. I was, I experienced abuse when I was a child, as did all the folks that I was doing time with. And, I found that these folks were also a victim of their circumstances, that, it didn't take me long, to be honest with you, to realize that the folks that I was locked up with were not these inherently bad people, were not evil people. And I'm talking about people who had been arrested and accused of really terrible things.
Talk more
And
about that. Talk more about that, Bud, because I think, understandably, quite frankly, people have a hard time with that concept. Even well-meaning allies on the left have a hard time with the idea that there are people in the prison system who did bad things, but who are not bad people and don't
yeah,
belong in these inhuman places, even though they hurt somebody, they killed somebody.
yeah. I mean, uh, look, I believe that people who I guess I want to start before I as I answer that, I want to start off with I believe that there are people who are dangerous and need to be somewhere to protect the community from the harm that they would likely commit if they were not there. So that's what I want to say first. There needs to be something, whatever it is that we end up creating in this world, for when people are acting in harmful ways to other people in the community. That said, we shouldn't be treating everyone again like they are inherently bad, inherently evil. Folks come from these situations of their own trauma and they don't know how to deal with them. They've never been given the tools to deal with their own trauma in a healthy way, and they bottle it all up. They try to hide from it, try to run from it. They're ashamed of it, and it comes out in ways in which they harm other people. It's a cliche, and some people might chuckle at this, but hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the way it is. I never did time with a single person in jail or in prison who hadn't experienced some form of trauma in their life, whether that was, child abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, that, they had done really bad drugs, had not received some sort of mental health treatment or medical treatment, had been stuck in poverty, had lived on the streets. These are all traumatic events that cause people to act out and inflict additional harm on the people around them. And that's all I experienced at every level of my detention and my incarceration. And I did time with people who were charged with multiple murders, people who had abused women, who had abused children. And I will tell you, even still, they were not inherently bad. What they did was absolutely heinous and terrifying, and none of us want those things to happen to anyone in the community, much less people that we love. But we don't fix these issues. I learned pretty quickly by treating people as we do when we send them to jail and to prison. We don't have any mechanism in American jails and prisons to truly heal people.
Yeah.
And so that's
Well, and
what I
there's
noticed, and I
there's
noticed that pretty quickly.
there's also the argument, and I want to ask you a follow-up question, but there's also the argument, in my opinion, based on my experience, that American prisons and jails, at least, are specifically designed not to heal people. They're designed to punish, and that whatever healing and rehabilitation is surface level at best. How long did you end
Yeah.
up doing in Arizona State Prison?
Yeah, so first when I got to jail, it took about 6 months for them to charge me with all of my offenses. I ended up being charged with 9 counts of robbery and armed robbery and 1 count of attempted armed robbery, and that was after I'd already been in jail for about 6 months. Shortly after all of those charges were filed, the state, in this case represented by a county prosecutor, came to my court-appointed attorney.
You fucking
And
public defenders, those goddamn public defenders.
this person technically wasn't a public defender. This is probably too inside baseball for this particular episode. You can address it another time. But this person was a court-appointed contract counsel.
which is all we have in Canada, by the way, Joe, at least
Oh, well, there you go.
in BC. It's all court-appointed
All contract.
counsel.
Okay. Okay. And so anyway, I'm not, I've disparaged this person plenty in my life. I've let that go. But he, I guess to put it nicely, he really didn't know what the fuck he was doing. And so anyway, they offered me 25 years about 6 months after I was incarcerated. I'll be honest with you. I was expecting 3 to 5, which I know is delusional. Anybody who's done time in the United States who happens to be listening to this podcast, you hear that I was arrested for 9 armed robberies and 1 attempted armed robbery, and I was expecting 3 to 5. Yes, I was delusional. I'm an idiot. Nevertheless, hearing 25 years as the plea offer was a bit jarring. And so I went into a state, I was depressed. I slept all the time. I was, suicidal ideation, all of that. And I went through this for about 3 years before and continued to get continuances in my case where maybe I would have a mental health evaluation, I would have a quote unquote settlement conference where both sides would get together to try to reach something that both sides felt was fair. In all of that time, my prosecutor never came down from the 25 years. And so eventually it was time for me to either sign the plea bargain for 25 years or go to trial, in which case I would absolutely be convicted because there was video of me committing my offenses. And on the day that my contract counsel came and told me that I needed to make this decision, he also told me that my mother had died. And so it was difficult, to say the least, to reach this conclusion. And there was a kid who was probably about 10 years younger than me at the time who had somehow found his way from Omaha, Nebraska to Arizona. And I want to put his name out there in case by chance anybody might know who this person is, because this kid literally saved my life. He was a light-skinned black kid from Omaha, Nebraska, who was a gangbanger and found himself in the Maricopa County 4th Avenue jail. He had light hair and freckles and a tattoo of an AK-47 on his cheek. And his nickname was Chopper. And Chopper asked me how my meeting with my attorney went, and I told him I had to sign for 25 years or go to trial. And also my mom died, and I don't know what the hell to do. I'm probably just going to go ahead and sign for the 25. And Chopper told me that that was insane, that no way in hell should I sign for 25 years. I said, well, if I go to trial, I'm definitely going to be convicted. And we talked about a lot of different things, and I told him how my attorney wasn't really doing all the things that I wanted him to do. And Chopper said, just represent yourself. Do it yourself. Represent yourself. Fire this guy. And that's just nuts. That's just absolutely nuts. And I went into my cell that evening and I thought about it. And for some reason, I woke up the next morning and I said, okay, I'm going to go and do what Chopper tells me to do. I fired my attorney, represented myself. Somehow, long story short, or long story somewhat short, I ended up finding out that what the prosecution was saying my sentence exposure was actually incorrect. They had said that I was going to be facing some mandatory life sentence. They were wrong. I told the judge what the actual sentence exposure was. He agreed. And at that point, I just pleaded guilty. I didn't go to trial and I didn't sign a plea bargain. I told the judge that I was guilty, and he had a ton of discretion to determine what my sentence would be. I think something between 4.5 to 214 years. He could have given me 214 years and it would have been legal. And yet I felt pretty confident that he was not going to give me 214 years. And so I pleaded guilty, went to sentencing about 6 months later. He gave me some folks to help me find mitigating circumstances for the crimes that I had committed. And ultimately, in August of 2010, 3.5 years after I'd been arrested, he sentenced me to 12 years.
How long did the prosecutor ask for?
Almost 20. He asked for almost 20 years. Yeah. And so, yeah, the judge gave me 12 years. I had already served 3.5. So then I was transferred into the custody of the Arizona Department of Corrections, which runs the prisons, most prisons in the state. And I served my time there until June of 2017 before I was then released to community supervision.
And I know we could do an entire episode on it. I do
Yeah.
want to move on to other things and not
Mm-hmm.
focus on your
Mm-hmm.
prison life. But again,
Mm-hmm.
for our listeners for many of whom this is very novel, if you could just take 2 minutes and describe what those years in prison were, especially compared to what people see, in media, read about in books.
Mm. I mean,
'Cause I want people to understand what the reality of a United States prison is from the inside.
yeah. Well, I'll tell you in Arizona and in most places that I know of anyway, in Arizona, 90% of the prison population is incarcerated in warehouses. These big open air sort of airplane hangar type facilities that hold anywhere from say 60 to 200 people. And they reside in bunks that are right next to each other. They have physical access to guards, they have physical access to one another. And this is literally 90% of the Arizona prison population, which is right now at about 38,000 people. So you figure close to 35,000 of those 38,000 are in these warehouses. It's not exactly the kind of place where you would put people who are so incredibly violent and dangerous that they have to be locked up. If you're willing to put them 60 to 200 in an open air warehouse, that really says something about their level of the threat that they pose to one another, to the guards themselves, and to the public. And, you know, not just that, but the relationships that I had in prison, you know, certainly you can't always be vulnerable because we are still in a desperate situation, a situation in which we're just looking for comfort, for some level of humanity. So you can't always let your guard down, but it is possible to find people that you can build a relationship with and trust. I had friends inside who are still friends with me to this day now that we are on the outside in community, who I love, and I look at them as brothers. I served in the military. I was in the United States Naval Reserve, and a lot of the experience that I had in prison wasn't too far from the experience that I had when I was in the military. You're going through a traumatic experience together, and you build that quote unquote trauma bond.
Okay.
And if you're lucky, you happen to find people who the relationship with, is stronger than just that trauma bond. And I was one of those lucky folks. We cooked together, we ate together, we stayed up late at night and talked about the kids that we couldn't be there with. The women that we loved back home who we would likely never see again, but we missed nevertheless. It was a situation that we were all struggling with, and we went through together, and we supported as much as we possibly could. It honestly, look, there were plenty of fights. I had my fair share of fights. You're in this environment in which everyone is still desperate and they don't know what the rest of their life is going to look like. They expect to not have much love or opportunity throughout the rest of their life, and they get a little agitated with that, and they feel like they've been dehumanized, and they wish they had a second chance, and they hate themselves for the things that they have, the mistakes that they've made, the choices they've made. And yet at the same time, there's plenty of quiet moments for us to reflect and to build a community, to be honest with you, especially when you're in there for 10 years, as I was. And so, believe it or not, it's a place where you will hear I love you a lot more than people might believe. Like there were men that I did time with every day that I would say I love you. And, you know, real bonds.
Yeah. Talk about, because Seeds of Revolution is an anarchist podcast. I'd like to sort
Yeah.
of shift into the confluence of capitalism and incarceration. And how
Yeah.
did you experience capitalism while you are incarcerated? And how does capitalism express itself I would assume usually negatively, if not universally negatively, through America's mass incarceration system.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways in which capitalism still infects prisons. I mean, it to me is the entire basis and foundation for prisons. First of all, you have just in Arizona, and you can extrapolate this out for the rest of the national American prison population, which is still close to 2 million people. In Arizona alone, we have 10,000 people who are employed by the Arizona Department of Corrections. These are people who are depending on, their weekly paychecks and their health insurance and hopefully building up a pension to take care of themselves and their families. So, the state has an employment system. That's part of their employment system is getting people to work inside the prisons, whether they work as guards or administrators or maintenance folks or whatever it might be. And so, that's certainly one way how capitalism our prison system. And then on the inside, when people go there, when people are sent to prison in the States, they usually go there with also some fines and some fees and maybe restitution for what they had stolen. In my case, I had restitution that they have been told that they'll have to pay either during or after their incarceration. Most will not be able to pay during their incarceration because they're just not getting money sent in from their families. Most aren't. There are a few, but most people don't get money from their families on the outside. But when they do get money from their families on the outside, their families are spending a lot of money, and we'll get to that. But fines and fees and restitution, those all still count. And that's building up while you're inside. You're gonna, by the time you get out of there, and which, by the way, 97% of people who are in American prisons are going to get out at some point. They're going to have all these fines, fees, and restitution they still have to pay. And so if you don't have anybody on the outside who can help take care of you while you're incarcerated, then you have a prison quote unquote job.
Mhm.
These are doing anything like for me, I was everything from a bathroom porter, which was cleaning up toilets and showers at the beginning of my incarceration, to being a GED tutor, where I was helping other folks who were incarcerated get their GED, get an education. I was eventually a library clerk for, I'd say, probably half of my incarceration, working in the library, getting books to other folks. All of these jobs, like the bathroom porter job, for instance, paid me 10 cents an hour. And it was, it was enough for me to maybe buy some toothpaste and soap every couple weeks because I made more than $9 a month. And if you make more than $9 a month, you have to buy your own toothpaste and soap, for instance, your own hygiene items. And by the way, there is a company that provides those kinds of things.
For-profit company,
Or
private
for
corporation.
profit company. Yeah, and from about half of my incarceration, I was locked up in a for-profit prison. Now it's a state prison, but it's run by a for-profit company. And then the other half I was in a state-run prison.
Could you
Both of those, however, are for-profit.
so describe the private prison for our Canadian listeners who thankfully are
Sure.
ignorant of that because Canada does not have a for-profit prison system.
Yeah. So there are private prison operators all throughout the United States, like Core Civic and some others that you can easily find online.
And these are companies that trade on the S&P. I mean, these are publicly traded corporations.
Oh, yeah, and their stock is very high right now, by the way. Can't imagine why. Anyway, yeah, they don't really build prisons, and what they do is they provide bodies to the state to work inside prisons as guards as folks who work in kitchens and order food or are supposed to provide healthcare. Healthcare in American prisons is largely privatized, even if the whole of the prison is not managed by a private prison company. The healthcare in almost all of them is privatized. And so again, these are private, most of the time publicly traded companies who are coming in and offering their services to the state, promising them that they can do the job that the state is supposed to do at less cost.
And they also
Uh,
have occupancy contracts, and this is something
yeah,
I really want people to understand. Maybe you could
bed
talk a little
quotas.
bit about these bed quotas and how it certainly smells and sounds a lot like slavery, despite
Yeah,
their attempts to insist that it's not.
yeah. Most of these contracts have bed quotas. In other words, you have to, you as the state, let's say I'm the private prison company. I tell you, I'm going to give you this rate per person that I incarcerate. I will
You tell this to the Arizona Department of Corrections, the
That's
state
right. Hey, Arizona Department of Corrections, I'm gonna make you a deal. I'm gonna save you a bunch of money. I'm going to right now, you're spending, say, $100 per person per day on everybody who's incarcerated in the Arizona Department of Corrections. Well, I'm gonna come along and I'm gonna drop that cost from 100 to 50 to just $50. Pay me $50 per head, and you're gonna save a bunch of money. Now, however, I'm gonna give you that rate, but you have to promise me that you're gonna keep 90% of all of my beds full at all times. At all times.
And if you don't,
Because uh, you're gonna still pay me that 90%. You're gonna pay me as if it was 90% full.
or I'm gonna sue you for breach of contract, and there's
Of
a
course.
penalty clause saying you're actually gonna pay more money if you breach your contract by not fulfilling your occupancy quotas.
That's right. And by the way, some contracts are not even just 90% bed quotas. There have been contracts in Arizona for 100%. Every bed will be full at all times. And so there's certainly an incentive for the state to make sure that all those beds are full, that there are enough people to make these private prison companies happy. But look, it, yes, I know the whole concept of private prisons is crazy, and not just to Canadians, but to Americans as well. But the entire system, yeah, there are private prison companies, but the entire system is for profit. In Arizona, we have about 20% of our prisons are privatized. Nationally, it's somewhere between 8 and 10%. The rest of those prisons are run by the state, entirely run by the state. However, there are still other private companies that come in to provide the food, or like I said before, provide the healthcare. But then you also think about what I said before, those 10,000 people that the state of Arizona, for instance, employs
Yeah.
to run all these prisons, to work inside these prisons, the administrators, the director of the prisons, the wardens at all the yards, they all have an incentive to uphold this system, to say, "No, we need harsher drug penalties," for instance, or, people need to be locked up for longer periods of time. That'll make us safer.
Mhm.
And so, I just want your listeners to keep in mind that it's not just private prison companies, it's the entire system that operates from a for-profit perspective.
How does this system regulate and control well, I should say regulate, prevent, and control how people inside experience the outside world? How does
Yeah.
the system absolutely dictate who you can talk to on the outside, when you can talk to them, if you can talk to them, if you can physically touch them? Because I don't know that people understand just how all encompassing it is, especially for somebody who was in there for, 9.5 or 13 years altogether, like you were.
Yeah. Your communication is controlled at all times, and oftentimes it's communication that you just can't afford because communication is a profit center as well. Me being able to talk to family on the outside over the phone is gonna cost them a lot of money still. to this day. Those costs had been significantly cut in the prior administration here in the States, but the new administration came in and returned those rates to their old glory
Hmm.
so that those communications companies could continue to make money. So whether that's through phone calls, whether that's through tablets that folks get where they can download a music app or a book app or a video visitation app to talk with their families for maybe 15-minute blocks at who knows how many dollars per minute. All of that, those financial costs are, pushed onto families on the outside. So it's not just people on the inside who are dealing with costs and being able to afford things. It's then pushed onto their families if they are able to stay in touch with them and get their support. Visitation is, highly regulated. There are lots of circumstances in which obviously I understand why. You don't want weapons and drugs coming into prisons. I get that. But even those, filling out an application to go see your loved one costs money.
Not even seeing them filling out the fucking application.
Filling out the application costs money. And so, because of this whole system, like people take risks inside because they can't afford it or because their families can't afford it, like I did. I, my daughter was 9 years old when I got locked up. And, around the time that she was a teenager, we started communicating, but I didn't have the money. She certainly didn't have the money to collect calls from her dad. So I started using smuggled in cell phones, and I could have gotten an escape charge and had at least another year and a half, 2.5 years added onto my sentence. But I wanted to talk to my kid. I wanted to be there for my kid as much as I possibly could. And that's what people do when they're locked up, to try and stay in touch, to try to be of service to their families and their loved ones. So visitation and your communication and your contact with family is highly regulated, and it's mostly, yet again, in the interest of profit.
And just so we can really focus in on where capital is turning its gaze, I know people instinctually know this most likely, but this regressive system it is the most regressive form of taxation because it's really focusing on the most economically vulnerable part of our population, because it's not rich people going to prison and it's not rich communities sending their rich sons and daughters to prison. And so when we talk about who's paying for phone calls, who's paying for tablet time, who's paying for the application to come visit, we are talking about the people who can the least afford anything over and above what they're spending money on just to keep food on the table and their house warm.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's like I said before, I never did time with anybody inside who hadn't experienced some form of trauma, and the foundation for that trauma was poverty.
Yeah.
Was, a lack of housing, lack of access to education, lack of access to employment opportunities, lack of access to medical care. All of those things add up to increasing debt or just inhumane treatment in community. And so, these are people who are coming from poverty, and then their families are struggling even more to sustain their loved ones while they're incarcerated.
How
So
much-
it's an endless evil cycle.
How much of this do you think is intentional? How much of the prison industrial complex do you think is a function of, and you and I've talked about Dr. Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, I mean, for years, but how much of this do you think is the intentional construction of a caste system? And how much of it is just a series of, I don't want to say accidental because it's not accidental, but it's a series of policy choices that might not have been intentionally made to create an underclass, a racial and economic underclass, but that's its actual effect. Is it intentional, or is it the result of generations of bad choices, or a little bit
No,
of column A and a little
it's
bit.
absolutely intentional. It's 100% intentional. This is the foundation of this system, and it's, the perpetuating the system at the highest levels is intentional. There are people who have been fooled into thinking that it is not intentional. It's just a byproduct, that there are winners and losers and, all of that. But no, as Dr. Alexander said, as my abolitionist friends have pointed out, as so many people have said, the system is doing exactly what it was set out to do. Uh, it is absolutely, a start. It started out as a way to, at least in the United States, to keep Black people enslaved in some way, to keep them under control, to keep them in poverty, to diminish their power, to keep them from power.
And
And
speaking of keeping Black people enslaved, I don't know how many Canadians know this, but slavery was never actually abolished in the United States. The 13th
Right.
Amendment, which most people think abolished slavery, contains a very specific exception to the abolition of slavery, and that's for prisoners.
That's right. Yeah. People can be forced to work if they are incarcerated in the United States.
And you were.
And
You and
so
your friends
I
were.
was.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if any of us refused to work, we would suffer the consequences. We would be isolated even further. We would be denied visitation. We would be sent to some kind of segregation where we were locked in a cage, just a cage, for longer and longer periods of time, access to showers, things like that. So, and and they can do those things just based on the fact that you are unwilling to work. And so, yeah, the system intended to do this, and it has expanded from one that was focused on separating us by race to now one of class and levels of education and, keeping all of us who don't have a pedigree, who, you know, are seen as the dregs of society, no matter what color you are, although the system still disproportionately impacts Black and brown people, but to keep all of us that those in power don't want anywhere close to power, prison serves that purpose.
I'd like to, we're running up about 45 minutes, so I do want to shift to your life after you were released,
Yeah.
your work since then, your creation of your own company, and basically how you're moving the ball forwards to change the system that you were forced to live through for so many years.
Yeah. So when I first got out, white guy out of prison, I had an education. I think a lot of folks, and I hate to be cynical about this because I'm very grateful for the opportunities I got, but I think a lot of folks looked at me and they were like, "Oh, hey, we can go ahead and give this guy opportunities. He's safe. We can tell folks, look what we're doing. We're helping somebody who's formerly incarcerated." And so I was given a lot of opportunities, whether that was in the nonprofit space or academia. And, I'm not gonna lie, I took advantage of every single one of them. And so whether it was being hired as a research consultant, that was my first gig out of prison, being hired as a research consultant. Again, ASU dropout, and at that point, formerly incarcerated person. And I did that. It kind of transitioned into a communications role for this nonprofit because of my journalism experience. The entire time that I was locked up, I missed out on smartphones. The
Probably a good thing
iPhone.
in retrospect.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, another 10 years of what y'all have been going through. No
Yeah.
thanks.
Save some
But
brain cells on that one.
yeah, yeah, thank goodness, because I have so few. I wanted to make sure everybody knows that's what I was saying. That's the joke. Anyway, yeah, they gave me an opportunity to learn about social media, and the whole point was to communicate the goals and the mission and all of the the issues around mass incarceration, and And having somebody who actually had some experience in communications as a journalist, as a storyteller, folks wanted to give me an opportunity to do that. And I wanted to. I don't speak really about my experience because, you know, one, I did really well while incarcerated at building up my own self-awareness, at, getting in touch with the reasons that I fell into the really bad situation that I had fallen into with compulsive gambling and, my career and everything. But I did all of that in spite of prison, not because of it.
Mm.
The system, again, as a white guy with an education who had, positive work experience and positive relationships and a positive, I had a career in which I had been on an upward trajectory. That was not the experience of like 99% of the people I did time with. So, a lot of people say that you come out of prison the same way you went out, or that you come out of prison the same way that you went in. And, when I went into prison, certainly I was in a bad state. I had robbed people. I had this addiction, but I had a lot of things working for me
Mhm.
that, allowed me, to be honest, to commit the crimes that I had.
Mm.
Nobody's expecting you know, this white guy in an SUV to drive up to their business and rob them, you know? That helped me commit my crimes. It helped me evade arrest for a month because nobody was looking for the well-to-do white guy in an SUV,
Mm.
right? And so, yeah, anyway, when I got out, I had all these opportunities and I took advantage of them. I worked in for this one nonprofit for about 3.5 years. We worked on sentencing reform. We worked on trying to help folks improve prison conditions inside. And then the pandemic happened and a lot of things changed. Our prison population here in Arizona dropped by about 25%. So that was a good thing that came out of the pandemic. Of course, we have now
Back up.
almost entirely erased those
Yeah.
those those gains. And so then I ended up working for a quote unquote progressive prosecutor here in Pima County, our friend Laura Conover here in Tucson. I told Laura that I thought that, if she really wanted to live up to her reform agenda, that she should hire a communications person who was formerly incarcerated. And much to my surprise, she agreed. She, in fact, hadn't even been looking for a communications person, but decided that she needed one. And so I worked for Laura for about 14, 15 months and just decided, working in politics in an office full of like 300 prosecutors and me probably wasn't the best fit. And so I decided to launch my own little agency, Hey Joe Media. Really, at the time, it was a work from home, like solopreneurship, as people call it. I had one client at the time. I was doing their website and their social media and trying to get them covered by local media. And then it grew from there. I've had nonprofits, nonprofit organizations all over the country now who come to me because I have experience in the prison system. And they come to me to help them improve their website, to make their website a place where people want to go and learn about the mission, to help them tighten up their messaging, to make sure that they are saying what they mean when they speak to the public, to the media. They come to me when they want their social media cleaned up and to be run more effectively. When they want to make sure that the message to get maybe a bad law off the books is the right message. And so that's what Hey Joe Media does. We've been around now for almost 4 years next month.
A happy
And
anniversary, my friend.
thanks, buddy. I love being available to all of these organizations because almost all of them come to me and say, we've been looking for the kind of communications person who understands the issues and faces all of these challenges with some sense of urgency. because we've got these people who are locked up and stuck in the system and can't get out of it. And we realize now that the problem was we didn't have somebody who had experience in the system. All these communications folks are either coming from a public relations background or some kind of corporate marketing background or something like that, or just, straight journalism. But there are so few, if any of us besides myself, who are doing this work from the lens of, being formerly incarcerated.
Let's start wrapping up by talking about next steps, solutions. So
Yeah.
going back to something you and I have talked about and lived through together. You were talking about your 15 months in the county attorney's office. Is there such a thing as a progressive prosecutor? And are progressive prosecutors a solution to mass incarceration in the United States?
I do believe that there is such a thing as a prosecutor who is a progressive. Uh, but at the same time, I don't think that a prosecutor needs to necessarily be a quote unquote progressive to effectively shrink the system. And we were talking about this before we started this podcast, but
We've been talking about this for 10 years, my friend.
no, I know, but this specific thing, I don't know that I necessarily call myself an abolitionist. I believe in working toward a world without prisons, but I also don't believe in like this purity test of you have to announce that you believe in the abolition of prisons. We should burn them all down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that that is necessarily virtuous or strategic. It's just not very strategic. Those of us who work to end mass incarceration, to abolish prisons, it's not a really great game plan or strategy to tell the other side that you are working to abolish prisons.
Now, I'm going to
You
push back on you a little bit
Okay.
because the right wing, some, myself included, might call it the neo-fascist wing in this country, has said I can't do math, since 1972, since Roe versus Wade, for 50 years, they've said we are going to abolish abortion in this country. And they did it.
Mhm.
Outside of a couple of blue states, they've successfully done it.
Mhm.
So why does that rhetoric not work, in your opinion, in the context of mass incarceration? Because abortion rights is one example. There's a lot of others. The right has staked out extreme positions all the time in our country and has seen wild success achieved.
Yeah. Well, I think you're comparing apples and oranges, first of all. I think that when the right says that they're going to abolish abortion, the majority of people across this country don't really think that that's going to affect them. If you say that you're going to abolish prisons, then the majority of people think, oh shit, that's going to affect me. You're going to have all these dangerous people running around without a place for us to put them when they do harm. And I expect them to do harm to me. Somebody not being able to get an abortion, I'm not saying that they are right. Obviously, we know all of the ways that abolishing abortion you and I understand the ways in which, and other people listening to this podcast understand the ways in which abolishing abortion impacts all of us, right? But the mass majority and the media that they are consuming does not communicate that to them. What is communicated to them, and almost entirely through mass media, through social media, through the damn air these days. When you say media, you might as well say air. Understand from what they are hearing that, well, if you don't have some kind of punitive system, some kind of system that puts people in a certain place, if you abolish that system and instead create these systems of accountability and healing, then my life is going to be threatened. The people I love, their immediate safety is going to be threatened. And so
is it just, and I use just in quotes, is it just a framing issue then? Is it the frame of prison abolition is different from other political frames?
I think that it is largely a framing issue. And I think it's also they're not going to like it.
It's all right. Go for it.
My abolitionist friends, I know you're not going to like this, but it is the belligerence of my friends who call themselves abolitionists, who sacrifice people who are incarcerated, who throw them under the bus, people who are still impacted by the criminal justice system long after they are gone from prison. They harm the progress that people working to end mass incarceration are trying to make when they come in and say it's all or nothing.
Mhm.
And so, they lead with all or nothing. It's abolition now, abolition forever. It's free them all right now. Burn them down. Man, you're just not getting anywhere with people who are actually in power and can make these decisions. People hear abolition from somebody, I don't care if they're on the right, if they're in the middle, if they say that they're on the left. Man, I have friends who have supported abolition before they became lawmakers, and now they don't touch abolition. They will not speak of it. They won't say anything about it because they know that there are other people in these systems that they need to work with to try to get people out of prison or to get laws changed who will just shut them down as soon as they start talking about abolition. Because we have not explained what our alternative is.
Mhm.
We have not done a good job of saying this is what we want instead. What people think of when they hear from an abolitionist is you support harm, you support crime, you support allowing people to just do whatever they want to other people. And we have not, those of us who are working toward an end to prisons and a world without prisons, an end of mass incarceration and a world without prisons, have not done a good job of explaining to people, no, that's not what we want. We want a system of accountability and healing for all. Prisons do not get us there. So we need to wind our way down, end prisons, end the system of mass incarceration, and come up with something else. If we could effectively communicate that to people when we talk about abolition, great. But most abolitionists that I find, and by the way, these are people who, by and large, do not have experience in the prison system, are not directly impacted. They come from academia. They come from the nonprofit world. They have lots of letters after their names, but they do not have experience in the prison system or have loved ones who have experienced the prison system. And they are not talking to nor listening to people who do have experience. They are telling them this is what's good for you and good for all of us is abolition and the language that we use. And God damn it, abolition or nothing at all. And honestly, I'm sick of it.
So how do we, maybe this is a good way to wrap up this conversation. How do we actually move the needle forward? If abolition, or at least the rhetoric of abolition, isn't working, what does work in your experience? And what are you focusing on to try and dismantle this horrific system we have back home?
So the most effective organizations that I work with, that I work for, are organizations that are led by people who are formerly incarcerated, who have experience in the system. If we start prioritizing that the people who are in charge of this movement to end mass incarceration, to abolish prisons, if we start putting the people who actually have experience, who can admit, like me, that it's not just entirely a systemic thing, at least with prisons, but that it's harm that we actually did that contributed to us being incarcerated, taking responsibility for our actions, whatever the other circumstances were that contributed to that. We can talk about that, as I have. Poverty, abuse, all of those things, right? But owning up to our actions is like one of our greatest strengths as people who have experience in the system. We lead with humility, we lead with accountability, and we say, yeah, I fucked up. And also this system is fucked up.
So we do that.
And
We put those people in.
we put those people in charge.
So
We
we
let them communicate it.
so we put those people in charge. But what are the specific tactics that you're employing? What are the specific policies you're pushing to try and ameliorate, if not completely revolutionize, this current system?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. Here recently, I helped an organization. They had just been trying to get funding for folks who were doing violence interruption, for instance, folks who were actually helping people returning home from prison have the resources that they need so that they're not falling back into bad behaviors, for getting support for victims of crime. And, the state didn't want to fund that. They had actually had a bunch of funding cut by this current administration. And so that was going to be it. And so, what we did was, just like I said, we went to folks who had been in the system and who supported a different way of providing accountability and healing and community-led safety. And we had those people share their experiences and tell their stories and go speak truth to power. And what we expected to be like a year-long campaign, we got the funding from the state within a month.
Wow.
By going out and having people share their experiences and work with community, organizations working with each other to support one another rather than stepping on each other's toes. And, like I said, this rigid hold to like some kind of abolitionist principle or whatever it might be. And people just came, they worked together, they spoke up for what they knew was right. And it was led by people who had experience in the system. And it worked. It got this organization exactly what the community needed.
Any other strategies that you think that people who are really trying to end mass incarceration should focus on? Any sort of policies that we should be pushing? Any sort of orientations that we should be adopting?
Yeah, I mean, I believe in bail reform. Here in the United States, we still have most of our communities are deciding who gets out of jail based on their level of wealth rather than the actual danger that they pose to their community. And so certainly bail reform is incredibly important. Violence interruption, which I just alluded to, investing in people who are outside of law enforcement and can talk with people in the community to settle disagreements and disputes and calm a community down. That's something that we should be investing in. And for organizations themselves, they need to get off of social media and they need to start building real community, going out and having actual events and talking to people and not being afraid to talk to people. We, with social media, we've gotten too comfortable hiding behind our phones and behind these platforms, and it's just not effective. We keep trying to do the next viral thing instead of just getting out there and talking to people and explaining to them what it is that we're trying to do. I find that when I talk to people face to face about my vision for ending mass incarceration, they are far more receptive to hearing me and watching me and hearing my passion and seeing me than they are looking at some carousel of slides on Instagram.
I mean, I'm always receptive to seeing you, my friend. I can't get enough. Joe Watson is the founder and chief strategist of Hey Joe Media. He is a former journalist, a spokesperson, and a communications director who's seen the criminal justice system from both sides of the fence. And probably most importantly, he is a really good friend of mine and somebody who I've looked up to and will continue to look up to for a very long time. So, Joe, buddy, always a pleasure.
Thank you very much, buddy. Love you.
Love you too.
Jesus Christ
God,
came
you're so
back
full of it.
today like you threatened he will. Which poor group of people do you think that he would kill? And who would Jesus choose to starve if you gave him the chance? And if there was a genocide, would he take a neutral stance? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would he say it's complicated and there's sinners on both sides? Or would he say that some people, they just deserve to die? If Jesus Christ rose from the dead and on a sidewalk slept, would you extend your hand to him or just watch where you stepped? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus hate the gay folk, the queer folk, or the trans? Would he suggest they end their lives according to God's plans? Would Jesus tell a homeless man to get a fucking job, or turn his back on the poor? Would Jesus be a snob? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus build a border wall? Would Jesus drive a tank? Would Jesus be a landlord? Would Jesus run a bank? Would Jesus Christ feel safe in his skin if he came to your town? And would you still believe in him if you found out he was brown? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Yeah, who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well,